You are carrying something that was put on you before you were old enough to put it down. And that's not poetry. That's documented fact. And by the time this is over, you're going to understand exactly how it got there, why it never quite went away, and why, of all the generations alive right now, you are the only one who could have handled it. My name is Frank. I have been watching your generation for a long time, watching how you move through the world, how you deal with problems, how you handle pain. And I have one observation before we go any further. You are exhausting to watch. Not because you complain, because you never do. The American Psychological Association's Stress in America surveys have consistently found that Gen X reports among the highest stress levels of any living generation. And yet, study after study notes something else about you, an unusual capacity to adapt, to keep functioning, to absorb impact without breaking down. Highly stressed, highly resilient, same people. That is not an accident. There is a very specific reason your life has felt like a series of obstacles since before you could walk. And it starts somewhere nobody talks about. Not with you, not with your parents, but with your grandparents. After World War II ended, an entire generation of men came home. And they had seen things that had no name yet, no diagnosis, no treatment. In 1980, the year many of you were already in school, the medical community officially gave it a name, post-traumatic stress disorder. Before that, it was called battle fatigue, shell shock, or most commonly, nothing at all. That meant millions of World War II veterans went home, became fathers, and had absolutely no idea what to do with what was happening inside them. So they did the only thing they knew how to do. They pushed it down, stayed quiet, kept going. And those men had children who grew up watching them be distant, or unpredictable, or just unavailable. And those children grew up and had children of their own, your parents. Then Vietnam happened. Over 2.7 million Americans served. Many came back carrying the same weight their fathers had, except this time they came back to a country that wasn't sure it wanted them there. Research on children of Vietnam veterans, particularly those whose fathers experienced combat trauma, has consistently found elevated rates of anxiety and depression compared to children of non-combat veterans. These weren't small differences. The patterns were clear and measurable across multiple studies. Those findings point to something important. Kids inherited something they never asked for, from a parent who had no idea they were passing it on. So before you ever had your first day of school, your household was already carrying pressure from 3 generations back, a weight that got passed like a hand-me-down coat, except nobody mentioned it was in the closet. Now let's talk about the world you actually grew up in. The divorce rate in America peaked in the late 1970s and early 1980s, right in the middle of your childhood. This was not a small change. This was a cultural earthquake. For the first time, large numbers of women had their own money, their own legal rights, and the legal ability to leave marriages that weren't working. And many did, which long-term was a good thing for society. But nobody was thinking about the kids in the middle of it. Because the research on what that kind of environment does to a child is not what you'd expect. People assume the damage comes from the divorce itself, the day everything got divided, the moving boxes, the new apartment. But that's not where it comes from. It comes from the years before, the tension in the house, the arguments, the thick silence where normal conversation should have been. Kids pick up on that really well, even when nobody tells them what's happening, especially when nobody tells them what's happening. And parents dealing with their own pain, their own inherited family weight, their own failing marriage, their own financial fear, have nothing left over. They're on empty. They're surviving. And surviving adults and thriving children require very different things. That's not blame. That's not a court case. That's just what was happening in millions of American households while you were trying to figure out long division. Here's the piece that most people miss when they talk about Gen X. A lot of your parents were physically present. They were in the house. Dinner was made, the lights were on. Nobody was calling it neglect because from the outside, everything looked fine. The problem wasn't physical absence. The problem was emotional absence, and that is a completely different animal. A Texas-based counselor named Janet Martinez put it plainly in a video that spread widely online. She said, and I'm paraphrasing, that Gen X had a specific kind of neglect, not always the visible kind, the invisible kind. Nobody asking how your day went. Nobody sitting with you when you were scared. Nobody teaching you that what you were feeling even had a name, let alone that it was okay to feel it. You had a roof, you had food, but emotionally you were largely managing on your own. And here's where it gets interesting. The human brain, when it's young, is building itself based on what the environment teaches it. And when the environment teaches it that emotional needs don't really get answered, the brain doesn't just shut down, it adapts. It says, "Noted. I'll handle it myself." And it gets very good at that. It builds a whole system for operating independently. You become self-reliant, capable, practical. You don't need to make a big deal out of things because making a big deal out of things was never something that changed anything anyway. That's a real skill, a genuinely useful skill. Gen X has it in abundance. But that same adaptation comes with something attached to it that doesn't show up until much later, often 30 years later. When your brain spends your childhood learning that the way to survive is to manage everything quietly on the inside, it never gets taught what to do when that management system gets overloaded. And it will get overloaded. Life will eventually put enough on the pile that the system starts to leak. That's not weakness, that's just physics. Picture a smoke alarm. Does its job, works perfectly. Now picture if it was just always going off. No smoke, no fire, just always on. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, and for a large portion of Gen X, it's not dramatic. It doesn't look like panic. It looks more like this. You're excellent in a crisis, better than almost anyone. When something falls apart, you know exactly what to do, who to call, what to say, what order to handle things in. People around you are freaking out, and you are somehow calm, useful, already solving the problem. But the second everything is actually fine, you feel slightly wrong, uncomfortable, like you're waiting for the catch. Because part of your brain grew up in an environment where the catch always showed up eventually, and it learned never to fully believe in fine. You might find it hard to fully enjoy good things when they happen, not because you're ungrateful, but because there's a part of you already running the what could go wrong from here calculation, already making contingency plans for a disaster that hasn't happened. You know that thing where you're having a perfectly good day and your brain suddenly dredges up that embarrassing thing you said at a party in 1994? That's not random. That's your nervous system checking in, still doing its job. This is your brain doing the job it was trained to do when you were small. When the household emotional weather changed without warning, your brain learned stay alert, always. It kept you functional back then. It made you tough. But that same alarm system doesn't know the original emergency is over. And just when you thought you had solid footing, the money stuff hit. Gen X entered the workforce and almost immediately ran into the 1987 stock market crash, then the early 90s recession, then the dot-com collapse, then September 11th, then 2008, the worst economic meltdown since the Great Depression, then a pandemic. Surveys on financial wellness have consistently found that Gen X carries significant financial stress, often reporting higher rates of financial anxiety and trauma than both older and younger generations. You've been financially destabilized repeatedly every decade, right when you were trying to get settled. And because of where Gen X sits between the generations on either side, researchers now call you the sandwich generation. Your kids are still financially and emotionally dependent, and now your parents need taking care of on the other side. So you are managing your own life, your children's needs, your parents' health, your finances, your job, and your marriage or relationship, and doing it largely without complaining, because complaining was never really an option that felt available to you. Someone asks how you're doing. You don't even hesitate. Fine, good. You? That response is one of the most Gen X things in existence. Here's something that doesn't get said enough. The generation that arguably needed the most help growing up also had the least cultural permission to ask for any. In the 70s and 80s, therapy was for people who were really visibly falling apart, not for the quiet accumulation of years of emotional isolation, not for growing up in a house where the love was real, but nobody knew how to say it. You were taught, not with words, but with example, that you deal with your stuff quietly and you keep going. Don't be a burden. Don't make it weird. Handle it. And that works. For a long time, that works incredibly well, until midlife. The American Psychological Association has found that Gen X utilizes mental health services at lower rates than younger generations. Millennials and Gen Z grew up in an era where talking about mental health was normalized. Gen X did not. You came up in an era where seeking help was seen as an admission of failure. The ones who didn't seek help, and that's a significant portion of you, are now experiencing something clinicians see regularly in midlife: the resurfacing of unprocessed experiences. All the things that got filed away at 10, at 14, at 22, they don't disappear. They don't expire, they wait. They start showing up as irritability that surprises even you, as an exhaustion that sleep doesn't actually fix, as a low-level frustration you can't quite name, the feeling that you've done everything you were supposed to do, and somehow it still doesn't feel like enough. A book called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by psychologist Lindsay Gibson spread through the Gen X community so widely that readers started calling it their guidebook. The online discussions just kept going, people recognizing themselves on every page. Because that's what's happening. Not a breakdown, not a crisis, just a slow, long exhale of things that never got to breathe the first time. Now, I want to tell you the thing that most of this conversation doesn't get to. You were handed conditions that nobody designed for you, inherited pressure from people who had no idea they were passing it on, emotional gaps that didn't have a name until 30 years after the fact, economic hits that arrived like clockwork, and you managed all of it, mostly alone, mostly quietly, mostly without a manual. That is not an accident of personality. That is not just who you happen to be. That is the direct, documented result of what you were put through and how your brain adapted to survive it. The toughness is real. The resilience is real. And so is the weight of carrying it for this long. Here's what changes when you actually understand where it came from. The same thing that made you great in a crisis. That's the hypervigilance. The same thing that made you self-reliant. That's the emotional neglect. The same thing that made you handle everything without complaining. That's growing up in a house where complaining didn't change anything. These are not character traits you were born with. They are survival skills you built under pressure when you were small. And you built them so well that they became invisible to you. You stopped seeing them as adaptations and started seeing them as just who you are. But here is the difference. Survival skills are for surviving. You survived. You are in fact still here. The question worth asking at this point in your life, not at 14, not at 28, but now, is what do you actually want to carry forward? Not out of obligation, not because no one else will do it, not because you've just always been the one who handles things, but because you chose to. That's not weakness. That's the thing you were never given permission to do back when it mattered. And it's available now. The most stressed generation among the most resilient. The generation that was handed too much before they were ready and handled it anyway. All the same people. If this video resonated with you, hit the like and subscribe button below. And also go ahead and check out one of the videos on the screen next. I'll see you there.